He's set apart for the Lord. He is holy because the Lord is holy. He has nothing to do, he's supposed to have nothing to do with wine or the grapes that wine are made from. And he's not to touch a dead body, neither animal or human. And he's not to cut his hair while he's under this vow. Does Samson keep these vows? Well, all except he's broken every one of them except one. He hasn't cut his hair yet. Yet. Now listen, he was set apart for the Lord. And here he's broken every one of the Nazirite vows except one. And he didn't get to that point overnight, did he? He crossed that line step by step. You know, he just walked on the edge. Sometimes we do that, don't we? We just walk on the edge of sin. Just walk on that line that separates the light from the darkness. We just walk along that edge. We got to teeter on the edge thinking, well, I'm not going to go too far to this side and sin. I'm just going to touch it a little bit. I'm just going to toy with it a little bit. And that's what Samson did. He toyed with sin. He walked the line. And at this point in our story of Samson, he's long crossed over that line. And he's fallen headfirst into sin. And we're going to see that tonight as we go through chapters 15 and 16. So please look at chapter 15, verses 1 and 2. After some days, at the time of the wheat harvest, Samson went to visit his wife with a young goat, and he said, I will go into my wife in the chamber, but her father would not allow him to go in. And her father said, I really thought that you utterly hated her, so I gave her to your companion. Is not her younger sister more beautiful than she? Please take her instead. Lord, as we dig into your word tonight, I pray, Lord, that although Judges was written thousands of years ago, it is still applicable to us today, as we see with Samson, Lord, and how he was just living for himself, Lord. And so many today are doing just that, even believers. So, Lord, help us to listen to your word tonight, to apply it to our lives, and, Lord, help it to change us where needed. We ask it in your name. Amen. So, if you remember, Samson was upset because his wife, his first wife, gave the Philistines the answer to the riddle, remember? And so he left the wedding feast. He never consummated the marriage. He just ran off. So he returns sometimes later to do just that, to consummate the marriage. But he finds out that his wife's been given to his companion, right? And that makes him angry. And listen, it would make any guy angry to come back and find out your wife, especially when you bring a young goat for the wife. He's really mad. Now, he's got great strength, Samson. He's got God-given strength. But he's impulsive, isn't he? I mean, if you remember how he got this first wife in the first place, he went down to Timnah, and he saw a woman that he liked, and he just said to his parents, hey, go get her for me. That's how impulsive he is. He's got great strength, and he's impulsive, and believe me, those are two traits that do not work well together. Look at verses 3 to 8 of chapter 15. And Samson said to them, this time I shall be innocent in regard to the Philistines. When I do them harm. So Samson went and caught 300 foxes and took torches. Now, that was a feat in and of itself. Have you ever tried to chase a fox? It's like chasing a squirrel. He turned them tail to tail, and he put a torch between each pair of tails. And when he had set fire to the torches, he let the foxes go into the standing grain of the Philistines and set fire to the stock grain and the standing grain, as well as the olive orchards. Then the Philistines said, who has done this? And they said, Samson, the son-in-law of the Timnite, because he has taken his wife and given her to his companion. And the Philistines came up and burned her and her father with fire. And Samson said to them, if this is what you do, I swear I will be avenged on you, and after that I will quit. And he struck them from hip to thigh with a great blow, and he went down and stayed in the cleft of the rock of Etam. So, this poor girl couldn't escape, could she? If you remember, the Philistines had threatened her early on that if she didn't give them the answer to the riddle, that they would burn her and her father's house. And so even though she complied, they were so angry at what Samson had done, they burned them anyway. Now listen, tying 300 foxes together, that's a feat in and of itself, isn't it? But it gives you an idea of how fierce this guy is. How many in this room would go out and grab a fox? Just one, just grab a fox by the scruff of the neck. He goes and gets 300 of them, ties their tails together, and sets them on fire. And so as they're running through the fields, it's got to be harvest time because there's standing grains of wheat in the field, and they're stacked, so they're harvesting. They burn it all up. All of it's gone. They go into the olive groves and burn all the olive trees up. I'd say that's enough to get the Philistines good and mad, wasn't it? And I think that's what Samson wanted. He wanted them mad. He wanted them so mad that they would get together and come after him. But instead, they pay a visit to his own people, who in turn pay a visit to Samson. And we're going to look at that in these next few verses. So they're going to find him in the cleft of the rock of Edom, now, which means a place of the ravenous beast. And that's a great description of Samson at this point, isn't it? He's a ravenous beast. Look at verses 9 through 13. Then the Philistines came up and encamped in Judah and made a raid on Lehi. And the men of Judah said, "Why have you come up against us?" They said, "We have come up to bind Samson and to do to him as he did to us." Then 3,000 men of Judah went down to the cleft of the rock of Edom and said to Samson, "Do you not know that the Philistines are rulers over us? What then is this that you have done to us?" And he said to them, "As they did to me, so I have done to them." And they said to him, "We have come down to bind you, that we may give you into the hands of the Philistines." Samson said to them, "Swear to me that you will not attack me yourselves." And they said to him, "No, we will only bind you and give you into their hands. We will surely not kill you." They didn't say the Philistines weren't going to kill him. They weren't going to kill him. So they bound him with new ropes and brought him up from the rock. So if Samson came with a theme song, the name of that theme song would be, "As they did to me, I'm going to do to them." And God tells us, right, in his word, that vengeance is the Lord's. It wasn't Samson's, it was the Lord's. But Samson never recognized that. His motto was, "Do unto others before they do unto me," right? But the men of Judah, sending 3,000 men to subdue Samson, gives you an idea of how much they respected this man's strength. I mean, normally, just a small detachment, a couple of guys, would be able to subdue one man. 3,000 men went to subdue him. But there's something very sad here that they say, the men of Judah say to Samson, "The Philistines have become our rulers." They had completely acquiesced at this point. They had become utterly complacent, accepting the Philistines as their rulers, not God. They had completely given in and given over. So they gather 3,000 men, and they go after the one man in all of Israel who had the guts to stand up against the Philistines. And they say they could have said to Samson, with 3,000 men and Samson, "Hey, let's join forces. Let's drive the Philistines out of our land." Yet they go to Samson and said, "Listen, you're making trouble for us. We're living among these people. We want to keep a good relationship with them. Stop causing trouble." So instead of driving the Philistines out, they deliver the one man who was doing anything at all about the oppression over to his enemies. Look at 14 through 16. When he came to Lehi, the Philistines came shouting to meet him, and the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon him. And the ropes that were on his arms became as flax that has caught fire, and his bonds melted off his hands. Did Samson break loose of the bonds? How'd the bonds fall off his hands? The Spirit of the Lord, right? Keep that in mind. And he found a fresh jawbone of a donkey, and put out his hand and took it, and with it he struck 1,000 men. And Samson said, With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have struck down 1,000 men. The Philistines are beside themselves. They finally have Samson all wrapped up, nice, neat little package, ready, all bound and waiting for him, right? But Samson has them just where he wants them. The Spirit of the Lord comes upon him. That's the source of his strength. I mean, when we get to the part where Delilah says they want to know where your great strength comes from, Samson he's not a big muscle-bound guy. He probably looks more like Pee Wee Herman than he does Charles Atlas. So no one knows if he's full of muscles, right, that's the source of his strength. But he's not, because the Spirit of God is the source of his strength. And the Lord comes upon him. The ropes fall off. He grabs the jawbone, a fresh jawbone. In the Hebrew, it's actually moist. So some people believe he actually took the jawbone out of a living donkey. Some people believe it was a donkey that had just died. But can you imagine the force it took to rip the jawbone off of a donkey? And he beats 1,000 men to death with that jawbone. Now that's up close and personal battle, right? In these verses, we find something about Samson that we didn't know. He's a poet. I mean, he wrote prose here, right? But in that prose, in that poem, he's taking credit for killing 1,000 men. He didn't kill 1,000 men. He didn't even break the bonds that were holding him. The Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and yet he did not give the Lord credit. And that's really a big part of his downfall. Let's finish out the chapter. As soon as he had finished speaking, he threw away the jawbone out of his hand, and that place was called Ramath Lehi. Ramath means heights, so basically that means Jawbone Heights. So any condos that are built there from this point forward are called Jawbone Heights. And he was very thirsty, and he called upon the Lord and said, "You have granted this great salvation by the hand of your servant. And shall I now die of thirst and fall into the hands of the uncircumcised?" And God split open the hollow place that is at Lehi, and water came out from it. What does that remind you of? Moses, right? And when he drank, his spirit returned, and he revived. Therefore the name of it was called En-Hakkore. And it is at Lehi to this day. And he judged Israel in the days of the Philistines 20 years. So, Samson is very thirsty. So thirsty that he fears getting so weak that he wouldn't be able to defend himself and would easily fall captive to his enemies, right? But look at the great victory the Lord just gave him. Where's his trust? See, his trust was never in the Lord. His trust was always in him and his strength. If we're honest with ourselves, you know, even when we've experienced victories and trials and tribulations in our lives, the next time a trial comes along, we cry out to the Lord, don't we? We cry out in fear that this time we're going to perish, Lord. For certain, this time we're going to perish. And for some, trust, faith, lasts only as long as it takes for another trial to come along. Samson's trust was in himself, and sometimes our trust is misplaced in ourselves as well, not in the Lord. Because when you trust in the Lord for everything, it takes quite a burden off of us, doesn't it? Good verse 16, chapter 16, rather. Samson went to Gaza, and there he saw a prostitute, and he went into her. The Gazites were told, "Samson has come here." And they surrounded the place and set an ambush for him all night at the gate of the city. They kept quiet all night, saying, "Let us wait till the light of the morning, when we will kill him." But Samson lay till midnight, and at midnight he arose and took hold of the doors of the gate of the city and the two posts, and pulled them up, bar and all, and put them on his shoulders, and carried them to the top of the hill that is in front of Hebron. So, Samson's impulsive, right? He sees something he wants, and he takes it. That's the story of his life. Whatever he sees, he wants, he takes. it doesn't matter that he's been set apart for God. It doesn't matter that he is to be holy, that he is to put God first. He puts his own needs first. He's committed to the flesh. He's not committed to God. And many Christians today are just as confused. They're more concerned with having their flesh catered to than walking in the Spirit, as we're all called to do. Now, the men of Gaza think they have Samson now. They think they finally have him where they want him. So they lock the gates, and the gates of the city are normally locked at night anyway, and they figure they have Samson trapped within the city limits now. He can't come in or out unless they know about it. Samson's got a target on his back at this point, doesn't he? He can't go anywhere without them noticing that he's there and they want to kill him. And that's what compromise does, and that's what Samson's been doing all his life, is compromising. It puts a target on us. Samson is someplace he should not be. He's been set apart for God, yet he's in a pagan city entertaining a prostitute, and everyone knows it. You know, when you tell people that you're a Christian, when we compromise, when we give in to sin, doesn't everyone know it? Doesn't it seem like everyone knows it? Doesn't it seem like they send postcards out and says, hey, you won't believe what he did, and he calls himself a Christian? That's why it's so important that we pay attention, because you never know who's watching you. So to make sure he doesn't escape, they camp outside the gate. They wait for him to come out. But they underestimate this guy. They underestimate the strength that God has given him. While they're fast asleep outside the gate, Samson nonchalantly walks up, goes over to the gate, and lifts the gate off the ground. Now, this gate is somewhere between 15 and 16 feet high. It is embedded into the sides of a stone wall. It probably weighs close to 2,000 pounds. And he just rips it off, right off the hinges, right out of the wall, puts it on his shoulders, and carries it up the hill to Hebron. Hebron is 40 miles away from Gaza. Uphill, 40 miles, he carries this gate. Without a problem, just carries it along. You know, the gates of the city represented the strength of a city. So by ripping that gate off, he's making a statement. I'm stronger than your entire city. Now, I'm certain that after waking up and seeing this maniac carrying their gate up the hill to Hebron, they decided, maybe we better not pursue him, huh? So Samson gets away. And in verse 4, after he carries the gate up to Hebron, he loves a woman in the valley of Sorek, whose name was Delilah. You know what the name Delilah means? It means to impoverish or to weaken. And she certainly fulfilled that in Satan's life, didn't she? Listen, Satan may not be able to read the mind of Satan. He can't read our minds. But does he really need to read the mind of Satan? I mean, if you spend enough time, read the mind of Samson, rather. If you spent enough time with Samson, you knew what his problem was. He had a weakness for women. Any pretty face that come along, Samson had a weakness for that. And all the enemy had to do was observe him. Sometimes that's all the enemy has to do with us, just observe us, to know what our weaknesses are, what buttons he can push, where he can attack us, where we're weakest, and use those weaknesses to weaken us spiritually. The name of the valley that he fell in love is called Zorek, and that's a place, it's called a place of choice wine or a place of indulgence. So he had no business marrying a Philistine woman from Timnah. He had no business putting his hands in a dead lion. He had no business visiting this pagan prostitute or falling in love with a woman who probably is from Philistine, Delilah. And he's has no business being in a place where they indulge in wine as a Nazirite. He has no business doing any of this. He's playing a dangerous game here. He's walking the line, and he keeps stumbling over this line, and he keeps falling into sin. And eventually, it's going to give way, as it always does. You can only walk that line. You can only toy with sin for so long, and eventually it gives way. The more you cross over that line, closer you come to failing. Look at verses 5 and 6. And the lords of the Philistines came up to her and said to her, "Seduce him, and see where his great strength lies, and by what means we may overpower him, that we may bind him to humble him. And we will each give you 1,100 pieces of silver." So Delilah said to Samson, "Please tell me where your great strength lies, and how you might be bound, that one could subdue you." Now, listen. Samson may be born at night, but I don't think it was that night. Maybe it was, because he doesn't seem to be very bright, does he? This has trap written all over it. You have a woman asking you, what's the secret of your great strength, that we may bind you? That we could bind you in a way that you can't get loose. Come on, really, Samson? I mean, you're really going to fall for this? And I don't think he really does fall for it. I think he's so arrogant that he believes he could play this game with her back and forth and not lose. But he must have a short memory, right? Because isn't this the exact same thing that happened with his first wife? Speaking of short memories, sometimes we allow ourselves to fall into situations that we have no business being in. And the reason we know we have no business being in those situations is because we've been down that road before and we know what happens. But yet, even though we've made those mistakes before, we find ourselves doing the exact same thing we've done that got us in trouble the last time. I guess that's called being human. But it's also called insanity. Doing the same thing and expecting different outcome, right? And that's what Samson does here. He does the same exact thing, expecting a different outcome. Look at verses 7 through 9. Samson said to her, "If they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings that have not been dried, then I shall become weak like any other man." Samson wasn't like any other man, was he? He was set apart for God. Now she had men lying in ambush in an inner chamber, so they're already in the house waiting for him. And she said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." But he snapped the bowstrings as thread of flax snaps, and it touches the fire, so the secret of his strength was not known. So he's playing the game. He's playing the game. He tells her, fresh bowstrings is the answer. That's the answer to my strength. Surprise! Here comes the Philistines. He's going to play this game until he loses, believe me. And Samson breaks free, makes quick work of the Philistines who were there to capture him, right? Look at verses 10 through 12. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Behold, you have mocked me and told me lies. Please tell me how you might be bound." At this point, you think, Samson, why is this woman so interested in what can bind me? You think you'd get the point, right? And he said to her, "If they bind me with new ropes that have not been used, then I shall become weak like any other man." Excuse me. So Delilah took new ropes, bound him with them, and said to him, "The Philistines are upon you, Samson." And the men lying in ambush were in the inner chamber, but he snapped the ropes off his arms like a thread. So Samson's a liar. She's calling him a liar. You're mocking me. You're not telling me how the Philistines can bind you in such a way that you can't break free. And so, okay, he says, this time it's new ropes. New ropes. If you bind me with new ropes, that's the answer. That's it. New ropes, and they can bind me and capture me. Well, again, there just happens to be some Philistines hanging out in an inner room. And surprise, here's the Philistines, Samson. Again, he breaks free. Philistines run away. And at this point, he could start a business and advertise the removal of Philistines from your home, guaranteed, right? Look at verse 13. Then Delilah said to Samson, "Until now you have mocked me and told me lies. Tell me how you might be bound." And he said to her, If you weave the 7 locks of my head with the web and fasten it tight with the pin, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. Samson, again, he's playing a very dangerous game here. He's getting closer and closer and closer to completely crossing that line. That last condition of the Nazirite vow was that he was not to put a razor to his hair, right? And here he is telling her to put his hair in a loom. And once again, surprise, Samson, the Philistines are here. He gets up, loom and all, and chases them. I guess his hair is even strong, right? 15, verse 15. And she said to him, how can you say I love you when your heart is not with me? And you know she's standing with crocodile tears running down her cheeks, right? You have mocked me these 3 times. You have not told me where your great strength lies. And when she pressed him hard with her words, day after day after day after day after day, there's not actually that many days in there. I just threw them in for effect. And urged him, his soul was vexed to death. And he told her all his heart and said to her, a razor has never come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If my head is shaved, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. I love you, Samson. All I want from this marriage is for you to be bound by the Philistines and taken away. That's true love, isn't it? She presses him day after day after day after day, just like his first wife did. You know, he can kill a lion with his bare hands. He can kill 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, but he can't listen to a woman nagging him day after day after day. That is pretty annoying. So he gives in. He tells her, if a razor touches my head, I become like any other man. And he really doesn't seem that upset about this, does he? Now, either he thinks that's not going to happen, or he just is so arrogant that he thinks it won't happen to him because he takes no precautions. You'd think that would be the one thing that he'd want to protect over everything else, but yet he gives her the secret to his great strength. Verses 18 through 20. When Delilah saw that he had told her all his heart, she sent and called the lords of the Philistines, saying, come up again, for he has told me all his heart. Then the lords of the Philistines came up to her and brought the money in her hands, and she made him sleep on her knees, and she called a man and had him shave off the 7 locks of his head. And she began to torment him, and his strength left him. And she said, the Philistines are upon you, Samson. And he awoke from his sleep and said, I will go out as in other times and shake myself free. But he did not know that the Lord had left him. So one more time, she cries, the Philistines are here. Surprise, Samson, surprise. Isn't this a surprise for you by now? And he figures, just like before, he's going to make quick work of the Philistines. He's just going to shake off whatever's binding him and go out and make quick work of it, not knowing that he has completely broken at this point his Nazirite vow, that his strength has left him, and he is as weak as any other man. And we have one of the saddest verses in the entire Bible here. God has departed from Samson. That last symbol of his separation was shaved off. You know, we can walk that line. We can toy with sin, but sooner or later we're going to cross that line and experience the feeling of losing fellowship with God. And that's the feeling that Samson has at this point. Verses 21 through the rest of the chapter. And the Philistines seized him and gouged out his eyes and brought him down to Gaza and bound him with the bronze shackles. And he ground at the mill in the prison, but the hair of his head began to grow again after it had been shaved. Now the Lord of the Philistines gathered to offer a great sacrifice to Dagon, their god, and to rejoice. And they said, our God has given Samson, our enemy, into our hands. And when the people saw him, they praised their God. For they said, our God has given our enemy into our hand, the ravager of our country, who has killed many of us. And when their hearts were merry, they said, call Samson, that he may entertain us. So they called Samson out of the prison, and he entertained them. They made him stand between the pillars, and Samson said to the young man who held him by the hand, let me feel the pillars on which the house rests, that I may lean against them. Now the house was full of men and women. All the lord of the Philistines were there, and on the roof there were about 3,000 men and women who looked on while Samson entertained. Then Samson called to the Lord and said, O Lord God, please remember me, and please strengthen me only this once. O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes. And Samson grasped the 2 middle pillars on which the house rested, and he leaned his weight against them, his right hand on one and his left hand on the other. And Samson said, let me die with the Philistines. Then he bowed with all his strength, and the house fell upon the lords and upon all the people who were in it. So the dead whom he killed at his death were more than those whom he killed during his life. Then his brothers and all his family came down and took him and brought him up and buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the tomb of Manoah his father, and he judged Israel for 20 years. So they gouge out Samson's eyes. But Samson had been blind long before they took his eyes. He was blind to the calling on his life, the calling that set him apart for God. And here he is, this once great and powerful man with a gift of strength from God. He's now tied to a mill, grinding grain in a mill. He's got plenty of time to reflect on what he's done, on the countless missed opportunities he had to serve the Lord. He could see now better without eyes than he ever could with eyes, because there's nothing to distract him. Notice, they took him captive. That's what sin does. It has a way of controlling us. It has a way of taking us captive. They blinded him. Sin does the same thing. It blinds us to the truth. They took him to Gaza. Sin separates us from our family, from our job, from our friends, even from God. And please know that sin has a history. All of what happened to Samson, this end, that didn't happen overnight. That happened over years of him crossing that line, toying with sin, toying with the very gift that God had blessed him with. You know, sin doesn't happen overnight, does it? It has a beginning. It has a history. One thing leads to another, to another, to another, and the next thing you know, we've separated ourselves from God. We've allowed it to blind us to the truth. And before you know it, we've become a slave to it. A slave to something to sin that Jesus set us free from. Now notice that even in his disobedience, even in his arrogance, even in his self-centeredness, God's grace shone through. Samson's hair began to grow in. That outward symbol of the power of God that dwelt in him began to grow back. And so he grabs a hold of those pillars, truly praying for probably the first time in his life, asking God for help. Before this, he trusted in his own strength. He trusted in the gift that God had given him to get him through any situation. But now he's trusting in the Lord for the very first time in his life. And he knocks down those pillars, that whole hall where they were meeting, killing more in his death than he ever did in his life, possibly including even Delilah, who many believe was a Philistine, who was probably there gloating over what she had done. God forgave him of his sin, but he still suffered the consequences of it. And for the first time in his life, God is glorified through his actions. The God of Samson is mightier than the God of the Philistines, Dagon. If you remember, around this time, or probably shortly before this, remember when the Ark of the Covenant had been captured, and the Philistines had it, and they put it in their temple to Dagon? And every day they came back, and Dagon, their god, was falling down face first. Then all of the people they had boils, and they had the rats, and so they made the golden boils and the golden rats, and they put it on the ark, and they sent it back. Dagon was their god. They credited him with the capture of Samson. But again, in the end, God had them exactly where he wanted them, didn't he? He had them all gathered together. Samson's given that last bit of strength, and he brings the house down. I guess Delilah got her answer, didn't she? Please tell us where your great strength came from. His great strength came from the Spirit of God. The exact same power every one of us has dwelling inside of us. The same power that could bring down strongholds in our lives. The same power to overcome trials. The same power to live a life separated unto God. Amen? Lord, thank you for our brother Samson. Thank you for his life, and thank you for the lessons that we learned from it. Lord, the book of Judges has really been an eye-opener because it really speaks to us today in the world that we live in. Lord, we're grateful for the word, grateful for you and what you've done. So, Lord, go before us now in this time of prayer. We ask it in your name. Amen.